Okay.
Good evening and good afternoon, depending on where you are. Welcome to Psych Incubator and Eminent Psychotherapists Revealed. I'm Jeffrey Magnavita, and with my co-host Barbara Ingram and Kristen Osborne, we are going to feature our guest, Dr. Christopher Muran. I'm so pleased to have you here tonight, Chris, and I know it's not tonight in some place, or maybe it's the middle of the night in some place. I know we have a lot of international people watching, so thank you all for joining. I've known Chris probably for at least a couple decades and have collaborated with him. And I think you've written a chapter in one or two of my books. And Christopher is sort of the penultimate clinical scientist. He both has a clinical practice and he's been a major researcher for the last, is it over 2 decades now? But for a while.
3 decades.
Wow, 3. I always try to reduce it down to the lowest now that I'm getting older. Chris is the Associate Dean and full professor at the Derner Institute of Advanced Psychological Studies at Adelphi, where he serves as training director for the doctoral program in clinical psych. Chris he's a fellow of the divisions 12 and 29 of APA, past president of the Society for Psychotherapy Research, past editor of the Journal of Psychotherapy Research. He serves on editorial boards for the Journal of Clinical and Consulting Psychology and a number of other journals. He's been the director of psychotherapy research program at Mount Sinai Hospital, Beth Israel, and is on the faculty at ICANN School of Medicine at Mount Sinai. I served with Chris recently on a task force. He's a wonderful leader and has a broad breadth of understanding of the literature, both clinical and research. Number of books that he's published, I'll just mention a couple. Therapist Performance Under Pressure, Negotiating Emotion Difference and Rupture with Catherine Eubanks, The Therapeutic Alliance, An Evidence-Based Guide to Practice with Jack Barber, and a couple of other books. He's also been featured in an APA videotape. And I'm just so thrilled to have you here with us, Chris, and welcome. So,
Thank you. Thank you for inviting me.
Our pleasure.
Yes, we do go back a long ways.
Yes.
Before we start with our questions, I wonder if Kristen and Chris, if you can rename yourself. Do you know how to use the rename feature? So
Thank you. Yeah.
Can actually see your names. But for those out there, Chris is the gentleman and Kristen is our gentlewoman. I'm messing this up with gender stuff, so I'm going to jump right in and say, Chris, I've been familiar with your work for quite a while, and the topic I want to address is your work on therapeutic ruptures and repairs. So I think would be great for the audience if you could describe what is meant by a rupture, and if you could give some examples or how you code ruptures.
Sure. Ooh, I could go on that one.
Well, that's good.
I know we talked about what to ask and what.
I forgot to ask you what not to ask. So.
No, this is an important one. And I think part of my pause has to do with the fact that I do feel like it's something that is sort of still in its evolution over time. But what I'll say is, originally our interest in rupture began with trying to understand the change process and trying to build off of all the research that suggests that the alliance is a critical change process, but wanting to do more about what that means. Of course, you could talk about alliance development, but then there's also the side of when things go awry and what that means. We were particularly influenced by Ed Borden's work, his reformulation of the alliance construct around purposeful collaboration, agreement on tasks and goals, and the affective bond, mutual trust and respect between patient and therapist. That was very organizing for us. And so at a very fundamental level, you can think about rupture as any kind of disagreement in how you're working and where you're working towards, and any kind of deterioration in that trust or respect. But we actually went on from that. And when I say we, I mean, I should be more explicit that my long-standing colleague, Jeremy Saffer, and I worked on trying to advance the notion and integrated ideas that were really emerging in the cognitive and emotion sciences and in sort of contemporary relational psychoanalysis, but more specifically on intersubjectivity. And so for us, we thought, wow, the Borden definition also allows us to think about what's going on in the patient-therapist relationship at an implicit level, involving negotiation of patient-therapist respective needs and desires. So Borden actually shifted things to make the alliance more mutual. And so I gave you an explicit definition about disagreement and deterioration, but at an implicit level, rupture can also be understood as a breakdown in the negotiation between patient and therapist needs. And then I'll be more specific about that. What we mean by that is, and what we particularly define in that respect, is how they negotiate the need for self-definition and relatedness. So this is sort of this existential motivational formulation that David Bacon introduced in the 1960s, that Sid Blatt advanced in the dynamic literature, but that Tim Beck also defined in the cognitive literature, that individuals are always negotiating this need for self-definition or agency, and this need for being connected, for communion, for relatedness, and that this is a dialectic that can lead to tensions and thus ruptures. So at the implicit level, we define rupture in that way. And then we've gone on further and talked about two particular types of categories of ruptures, withdrawal markers and confrontation markers. And withdrawal markers are any movements away from either an aspect of oneself or the other. So by self, I mean like any dissociative move where you're moving away from an emotional experience. So it's kind of consistent with self splits in the emotion focused literature, or experiential avoidance in the ACT literature. And then of course movements, people understand movements away more easily. So it can involve movements away from self, can be marked by content affect splits, where you're talking about something sad but smiling. It could involve movements to appease the other, to make nice and therefore sacrifice something truer.
Chris, just interrupt a second. Would you say what you're talking about is defenses in a sense? It sounds like you're very much describing defensive actions.
Yeah, I mean, there's different ways, different models have different terms. And actually, I've actually had fun listing all the possible terms that are similar. Certainly there's an overlap with defenses, resistances, but we've tended to stay away from that language, just not because it's wrong, but it just also brings a different metapsychology to the fore. And so going back to this notion of intersubjectivity, it presents a more balanced view of the interaction. And defenses and resistance kind of has like a one-person orientation.
What about countertransference and transference? How is it how does it map with that?
Interesting idea. Although I think, and hold me to getting back to the definitions too. But I remember going through analytic training. Ben Wallstein was an old school interpersonal analyst, never liked the term countertransference. He thought it was all about transferences, patient transferences and therapist transferences. Counter implies that it's always reactive.
Interesting, yeah.
And it undermines the contribution of the therapist.
Mm-hmm.
I think the other problem with transference is, it suggests that in some ways you can like distinguish what is real, what is unreal. And again, from an intersubjective perspective, that's a tall order, and things are, that distinction, that demarcation is not so realistic, or maybe even useful. And even Greenson, when he made the distinction between transference and real and working alliance, he argued it's conceptually useful, but in practice it may not be so useful.
Okay.
And so coming from an ego-psychological perspective, he even recognized, although look, the field's taken off with that tripartite model, but we didn't want to necessarily buy into that. Although, Jeffrey, certainly there's overlap. Certainly we're talking about similar things. Certainly when we talk about rupture, we're talking about, in many respects, transference or countertransference interactions. And
so you're talking more about negotiating the intersubjectivity between self and other, and
definitely want to make sure the therapist is in the frame. The therapist bringing in their own subjectivity, their own personal histories, their own implicit biases, their own constructions from their past, and so by staying away from that other language, it allows a more balanced understanding of it.
Thank you. That's helpful.
I noticed, Chris, like I've had the luxury of seeing both your work and Jeremy's work, and of course, comparing it to affect phobia therapy. That's the model that I use, that was developed by Lee McCullough. And what was so fascinating for me is how you work in the moment. I mean, you're like experiential on speed, right? It's like even on those moments, like where the patient's clearly like sharing the psychodynamic information that most of us would just like follow, like we would just be like dogs chasing meat, right? You and Jeremy are just like able to just stay in the moment, hold what's happening between you and the patient. And then what I found was remarkable, the psychodynamic issues would still come to the surface, but in a different way,
Totally. I mean,
and it's beautiful to watch.
Thank you. I think the thing to remember, I know when we met earlier, we were talking about history, so I'm going to weave in a little history here.
Thank you.
I mean, the thing to remember is, both Jeremy and I had roots in the cognitive world. I was his postdoc on a cognitive therapy unit at the Clark Institute of Psychiatry. But at the time, Jeremy, was collaborating with Les Greenberg. Jeremy has very strong Gestalt roots. And at the time he was trying, and Les and Jeremy were trying to, they were writing and working within the cognitive world, trying to bust out and expand their horizons. And so Les went more emotion focused and Jeremy went more interpersonal. And the interpersonal psychoanalytic tradition is incredibly rich in trying to stay descriptive, and you read some of the interpersonalists like beyond Sullivan to like Levinson, and it's all about really describing experience in the here and now in a very rich way. And so it actually worked nicely with a more humanistic perspective. So that kind of way of working was very much informed it's like emotion focused and interpersonal. And then in the 90s, I did my psychoanalytic training at NYU postdoc, which was the home of where the relational movement really took off with Steve Mitchell and Manny Gent being the leaders of that, and Steve Mitchell, and when students like Jessica Benjamin, who was hugely influential to my thinking, and also Lou Aaron, who was a supervisor of mine too, they made it more intersubjective. So they took the interpersonal and took it to a more intersubjective realm. And intersubjective meaning, because that's used in different ways, but Jessica's version of it, which is like a blend of existential feminist thinking, and really highlights the power plays that go on and the role of objectification and negation that goes on in human relations, and of course in the therapeutic relationship, all towards this movement towards mutual recognition. So even mutual recognition should be understood as something different than empathy, because mutual recognition brings into the fore recognizing the subjectivity of both participants in the moment. And that gets to the resolution also of the dialectic that is in the self-definition and communion, but also in this objectification, subjectification, the related dialectic there. And that for us has always been at the heart of rupture repair. So for us, rupture repair is about objectification and negation. And you have your withdrawal types, and withdrawal or movements, like isolation, appeasement, confrontation is movements against, criticisms, attacks. And I think originally, I know originally we concentrated on defining rupture in terms of patient behavior. So rupture markers were defined in terms of patient behavior, even though we conceptualized it as a rupture as an interaction, as a
Dyadic phenomena.
A dyadic phenomenon, but we're just marking it by patient behavior, always knowing that we could easily flip this and code it in terms of therapist behavior. And so most recently with my colleague, Catherine Eubanks, we've really got aggressive on defining the therapist markers of rupture. And that's clearer in our most recent book, and it's clear in the measure that Catherine has taken the lead on over the last 12 years or so. So that's fun, because we're really kind of subversive. We're really trying to unmask the contribution of the therapist more.
So Chris, back when you first started at Beth Israel, during that time in my career, I was in clinical practice, and I was experimenting with a number of different approaches and getting my own treatment, got my own psychoanalytic treatment and so forth, and short-term dynamic treatment. And I working on my first book, Restructuring Personality Disorders, I came upon the research that you did when you were with that group there. And it was so groundbreaking in a way, because very few people had taken a look at personality disorders, and we can talk about what they mean and what they are, and if it's a credible term or not.
Right.
I don't want to get into that; it'd be a whole nother discussion. But I do want to talk about how influential that certainly was for me in the field, in terms of showing that you actually can affect change with the more challenging patients, especially. I mean, I think it's the only research that I've seen on empirical evidence for treating cluster C personality disorders, the depressive, the avoidant, and the obsessive. So could you tell us a little bit about that time in your career and what that was like, and what that meant, who you're working with? Because I think our viewers would be pretty interested in the history there.
Yeah, I think in the 1980s, I mean, the most critical figure in all that who is a bit unsung is Arnold Winston, who was the chair of psychiatry at what was then Beth Israel Medical Center and now is Mount Sinai Beth Israel. And Arnold was incredibly, I mean, it's when you think about what he did, I mean, he started a psychotherapy research program in the early 80s, a medical center, a psychiatrist setting up a psychotherapy research program. And, he had a lot of, enlisted a lot of colleagues, and Lee McCullough was part of that group. And initially, they were really interested. I mean, this is stories that were passed on to me because Arnold hired me in 1990. Initially, they were interested in Davenlou's model, and I think, but because the story I was told was because they were interested in running a clinical trial. They had to sort of set things up where it was more apples to apples. And yet I think Davenlou's model had, and Jeffrey helped me with this, but I think like they had a trial therapy assessment.
Yeah.
Is that what it was called? Trial therapy?
Yes, trial therapy. Yeah, it was like a 4-session block, and it was very intensive, and it was to determine whether you're a good candidate after 4 sessions, if you crawled out of the office or if you had to get taken out on a stretcher.
Right, it's a little problematic because if you could survive the slings and arrows of that, then you've got incredible ego strength, and you probably could do well on anything. But to have that, so I think Davenlou really wanted that in place, and that became problematic when you start comparing it with other models that didn't have something like that. And so I think he bailed from it, but then Arnold enlisted help from Peter Sifnio. So in the end, they developed a short-term dynamic model that was kind of a blend of Davenlou and Sifnio.
He was very inclusive. He had me come down to Grand and do a grand rounds there. I was like a nobody from Connecticut, and he had me come down to do a grand. He was just a very.
He was a Papa Bear. He was definitely a Papa Bear. And but like cutting edge, it was amazing. So and then we added another dynamic model that was a little closer to what Laborsky and Strupp were doing. And then they were playing around with 2 dynamic models, one that was a little more cognitive and one was a little more affect focused.
Yes, yeah.
And then when I got there, they were then introducing the cognitive behavioral model. And when I got there, then I was helping them complete that 1980 study. So that's why I landed on that paper, but I was helping with the analyses. And
I think that was like a series of 3 papers they got out of that research.
Yeah, it was really, but I think you're right, Jeffrey, it was really important. And then when I got there, and I always tell the story about my time there, and I'm still there actually, that in some ways it kind of mirrored the field. So in the beginning of the 1980s, Arnold was interested in do these therapies work? Can we get good outcomes? And can we get good outcomes with personality disorders of cluster C or NOS following a DSM formulation? And when I got there, and I was, maybe as Kristen's saying, we were really hyper focused on process, but we were less interested in does therapy work, and like much more interested in how it works. And so I came from Arnold hired me. It's remarkable. I was 28 years old, and he gave me the reins. He gave me the reins of a research program that, I should ask him, what was he thinking?
He made a good decision, Chris.
But yeah, I guess.
No, he did. He really did. Your work over the years has been remarkable.
I guess he was happy. I mean, yeah.
I bet he's happy now to see what you've all accomplished.
Yes, absolutely. So, I had all this energy and all this focus, and I had all these new tools. And so I was gonna focus on unpacking the process and get at this rupture model. I came from Toronto to New York. I was originally a New Yorker, so it wasn't like I was coming home. But Jeremy at the same time took a position in New York, and he was Canadian and came to New York, and I invited Jeremy to consult on the research program and that we could continue working together, because it was it seemed like it's such an important and productive collaboration in Toronto. And so then we went after the process, and particularly what are ruptures, how do you repair ruptures? So the 90s was very much about understanding the process. And then the next decade was more about like training. I feel like the field of psychotherapy research has shifted in a similar sense. Was concerned about outcome, moved to process, and now it's more like trying to understand the therapist side, the therapist variable better. And so we kind of moved in a similar sense, and our two NIMH grants reflected that. The first one was more about defining the rupture repair process. We did develop a short-term model that was very phenomenological called brief relational therapy. During that, it was part of that grant. It was never really a primary aspiration. I think both Jeremy and I were a little bit cynical about too many
Being guru, you didn't want to be a guru?
Well, too many therapies, too many acronyms. Like, what do we, like, are we really different? And like,
alphabet soup.
Yeah, are we going to go to NIMH with yet another therapy, for depression or whatever? It was always about the rupture repair process and trying to develop therapist skills to more effectively work with that. The treatment model emerged because of the nature of the research that we submitted funding for, that we needed to have something like that. I won't go into that.
Yeah. But can you give us a like, for all us clinicians, if you were to say, here's the basics of identifying a rupture, and then what are the actual pragmatics of what I do if I have a patient that says, no, you don't get me, or I'm going to leave the office because whatever. What do you do?
Well, I like approach it in two ways. Attitudinally, curiosity and humility are like huge. So being curious about what's going on between us, a very old interpersonal adage. And the humility part of recognizing that you're part of it. You've contributed in some way, and you really need the other to understand what's going on. So it does challenge the idea of the power of the therapist.
The omnipotence?
The omnipotence of what does the therapist know?
Yeah.
And so it's very dialogic in its epistemology.
So curiosity, and then
humility,
and then what? What do we do then?
And then practically, how you translate that practically is, it's amazing to me. The first part of it is like trying to attend and recognize ruptures, becoming more sensitive to me. I remember doing a workshop, many years ago, and typically in a workshop, the morning you spend time defining ruptures, then you break and you spend the afternoon talking about repair, something like that. And I did that, and we broke for lunch, and it came back, and somebody right away stuck their hand up. It was like they had seen a patient during the lunch hour, and they were so blown away because they were so much more aware of rupture, and that kind of transformed things, without even talking about repair. So right away, I would recommend, look at some of the things that we've written about defining rupture. So you sensitize. It's like putting on new glasses, and you start looking at process differently. Start using your internal experience. We talk about interpersonal markers, behavior in therapist and patient, but interpersonally, you can use your emotional experience as a marker. Intrapersonal markers, like if you're feeling a little uneasy or a little uncomfortable or something more extreme, defensive, or that's a marker that your internal experience should be a compass that something's going on. And so that's the rupture recognition side. The resolution side, I mean, very simply, invite a conversation, invite and try to invite it in as non-defensive a way as possible, where you're saying, and I'm not actually even suggesting that you apologize. It's not a matter of apology. And
Although
sometimes
it can be, right? I mean,
it could be, but sometimes the apology steals, it distracts,
Yeah.
So it all depends. Sometimes apology would be not a good thing to do because it
Yeah.
takes away the opportunity to explore.
For them to be angry at us.
Yeah, so it's not. There's a Howard Jones song from the '80s. Dating myself, no one's to blame. But it's like it's in a sense, there's no one's to blame. And if you take that attitude, you can or you may not apologize. Depends on what it was, and but it's really about being non-defensive and like, well, like I'm aware, feeling uncomfortable right now. Does that also make sense for you? And can we talk about what might be going on? Or I noticed you kind of turned away, or you changed the topic, and what might that be about? Or I'm aware I'm like babbling. I'm like saying a lot of psychobabble here. Like I don't know what I'm doing. So can we talk about why I might be doing that? What's going on? And then I also think this is where the medical psychology is different. There's the use of self-disclosure, and in that regard, I'm talking about affective self-disclosure. But there's also inviting questions from the patient about what they see in you. And in this respect, and this gets back to like that intersubjective dialogic epistemology, you're not hunting for projections per se. You're actually really curious, like they may see something that you're not aware of. So you're asking a genuine question, not a leading question, or you're actually, you really want to open up the discussion. So it might seem simplistic, but what you're talking about is inviting an exploration, inviting a dialogue. We have a model where we go really deep and we unpack underlying wishes. Honestly, from the research we've done, and Jeremy, I kind of I don't know if we'd laugh about it, but at least we'd smile about it. We have this, I think as researchers and maybe as clinicians, we're always looking for the holy grail, this kind of unpacking of this underlying wish or need. But I think we both felt and I feel that that's not necessarily necessary, that just the very act of being curious and inviting and then trying to put words to experience, which by the way is very emotion regulating.
So Chris,
that could be a new relational experience, a corrective experience in and of itself. Anyway, I'll stop. Go ahead, Kristen.
Yeah, Chris, I mean, I want to challenge Jeremy and you right now, because I do think the two of you have been looking at the Holy Grail together. I mean, if you look at Ed Tronick's work and his most recent book, that's a more mainstream book.
Yeah, I've read it.
Really?
Yeah.
What's the book?
Discord, Power of Discord, something like that.
Power of Discord.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
Okay,
Yeah.
Somewhere.
And so if you take Ed Tronick and you take your work, right, and you put it together and you bring Oprah into the room, right, like all of a sudden we have the capacity to educate so many people about the importance of conflict within relationships and like how to do it.
Yeah.
And in fact, I would love for you to get in contact with Ed.
Yeah, it's funny because
and Oprah.
Oprah.
Oprah. I'm glad you raised that, because I've been thinking a lot about. I mean, so Ed's work has been very influential all along.
To many of us, yeah.
Since the 1989 American Psychology. I mean, that was always there, always present. And it's interesting because he'll cite our stuff, like even in the Power Discord, there it is. And often I'll when I present on rupture repair and I talk about different like-minded research and like-minded notions of repair, we'll invoke Ed's work. And then there's a lot of research that's supportive to what we're doing. But I was thinking, having read the book, and I also have a colleague at Beth Israel who was one of Ed's students. So they collaborated on a special issue for psychotherapy research that I guest edited. I was trying to think about the ways it might be different. See, I love the idea that human relations are inherently messy, and that's just not just Ed's idea, but that's an old existential notion. That's Jerome Bruner. There's so many people that talk about the messiness of and this idea of like being attuned and then misattuned, but if you think about it, it is like-minded, but it is also kind of different from what we're talking about. So it is a form of misattunement and then repair and then reattunement. It is a form of repair in a sense, but so for us, we define different forms of rupture and repair models. That's one pathway. Like, I'm with you, I'm not with you, I'm back with you. Okay.
But I think getting back to Tronic for a minute. For those of you who are watching who haven't seen the still face video, Google that and watch it. I put that up for everybody to look at. But I use that often with my patients who I think have pre-verbal trauma, because that's a limbic probe when people watch that. It's amazing to see what happens. For those of you who don't know
Beautiful.
He asked the research subject, who's a mother with looks like a very secure attachment, with a 9-month-old infant, to go still, and within a minute, the infant is protesting and inviting the reconnection, and gets so distressed that loses postural control and starts screeching. And as soon as she reattunes, it's like exactly what you're demonstrating and talking about and researching in your.
But it's more like primitive and microanalytic, and I do believe that process goes on with our patients. We're with them, we're not with them, we're with them. But then we're also, the other types of rupture repair that we're talking about is when there's a disagreement how we're working together. That seems a little more. That's a little,
Chris,
at a different level.
This is where I think you are sitting on the Holy Grail, and I'm feeling passionate right now, because how useful is this just for therapists in academia? I mean, if you were to literally be, let's say, on stage, and Oprah said, let's do a role play, and you could actually show people how to process in the way that you do, it would be extraordinarily helpful to them. And it would really, help people understand that, conflict's natural, anger is natural, we don't have to follow like, this unwritten law that anger is bad.
No, I agree.
So,
I agree. I think I'm just making a distinction between different types of rupture and different types of repair, and that what we modeled is a more complex cognitive affective, where I always feel like, and I've just been thinking about this more since reading the book, that it's common ground, but it's like it's on a different channel that he's talking about, and it still speaks to the messiness of human relations and the importance of disconnect and reconnect. But is that managing intimacy and closeness, our longing for connection, and our need to have autonomy and so I always feel like in all my relationships, I'm always in that ebb and flow space, and that there's people that are more disturbed, the space, the range, like when you think about borderline phenomena, the range is, 1 minute you're in fusion and next minute you're in like, I hate you, don't leave me space. And so it seems like we're always, is that what you're talking about, negotiating that intimacy and closeness Yeah, and I think
Space.
what Ed's work and other developmental researchers similarly are talking about something though at a more like primitive way of it. And I think so it's not inconsistent, but we're talking about, I think we're talking about something that's a little more cognitive, it's a little more mutual recognition type. It's like, it's a little, oh, I see you and I see that, and you see me, like.
So is that
It
more
has much more of a-
mentalization? Mentalization, is that what you're talking about?
Well, it does definitely, yeah, I think we're definitely
Yeah.
close to that as well.
Excuse
So
me, I'd like to jump in because
Sure.
I just want to bring this into something I read about your group supervision. And that's very close to what I do in the
Mhm.
teaching and working with students who haven't even seen their first clients. So could you describe when if you're sitting with a student therapist and going over the videotape with them, what exactly would you do? Would you choose to stop at a certain point? Could you just describe the kind of conversation that would happen?
Okay. Oh, I always find these like, I don't have straightforward answers, but nothing seems straightforward to me. Anyway, I should say a little bit about the AFT, the Alliance Focused Training Model, which was, when we developed that, we really wanted to, we were trying to learn from previous research, previous efforts, traditional approaches to supervision, which is you sit with your supervisee, you either hear what they say or see what they did, and you tell them, what to do, essentially. And we wanted to create more of an experiential event. So we felt change would happen more to the extent that we could shape their relationship to themselves. So when we approach supervision, we include mindfulness training to like help, in a sense, grease the wheels, help try to like establish a sensibility that would help the process. And actually, there's a lot of interesting research now that suggests that you can use mindfulness to prime even how you work in a session. If you have people do a little mindfulness exercise before a session, it's been shown that it improves the interpersonal process. But we include mindfulness training for our therapists to develop their observational stance towards themselves. And then when we watch, they record their sessions, so they play their sessions. A trainee will play a session, and I'm more interested when they're watching it, what they see and what they either feeling in watching it or what they remember feeling when they were with the patient. So for me, it's more about developing their awareness. So a little bit, it does definitely mirror the treatment model. We're not trying to like resolve a conflict or correct an irrational belief. We're trying to expand their awareness. Because we know in the end, whatever's going on between them and the patient can only get resolved with the patient. The patient needs to be present. So my goal in working with a trainee is to prime them for that dialogue, to put them in a better position to have a productive dialogue with their patient about what the hell's going on between them. Does that answer your question, Barbara?
Yeah, but even more like, so you use role play with
Yeah, so
supervisees?
right, and again, that's sort of like, again, priming, like getting them to play with, this principle of meta communication, which I haven't said explicitly, but that's just inviting a discussion about the communication process as it has been unfolding. And because for us, it's not, and this is also informed by the performance science literature too, that we want them to play with the possibilities and explore maybe some of their fears and expectations. So for example, we'll do, this is here's Jeremy's Gestalt background, but two-chair work is a huge part of our training. And we'll have patients, we'll have trainees play both their patient and themselves in the role play. And so we let them play. How would you imagine let's take it from this interaction that we just saw on the videotape, try to, and after having discussed it, we could talk about the process and what the rupture might be and what might be going on. So try to invite a discussion about it, and then having them play their patient as they would expect the patient or how they would fear the patient would respond. And then it allows them to start putting words to their internal experience and what they might be afraid of with regard to their patients. And so much about therapy when we look at our research is really very cool for us, because we do a lot of interview assessments, and we have a lot of data having interviewed our trainees, and they talk about how freeing, how scary the training is, because you're putting yourself out there and you're exposing yourself, but also how freeing it is, and how much they're able to begin to start recognizing some of their anxieties, and how much that puts them in a better place to have an open conversation with their patient.
So two questions. One is, what do you think is curative? What do you think heals? And do you think this research should be focusing on what expert therapists do to get good results, a la Lambert's work that the top 15% get really good results? Is it the therapist or is it the therapy?
You guys are really good. You guys are asking great questions. I'll take the first part of that. First part was
what's curative?
What's curative
in your experience and research?
Yeah, I definitely think being able to talk about experience, putting words to experience in front of another can be hugely curative. I think that we can attribute it to emotion regulation. We can talk about it in different ways, but I think the power of symbolizing experience in front of another is hugely curative. It's not the only
relational. It's very relational. It's all about.
But I'm also, having worked in different models, I'm not a believer there's only one change mechanism, and I can also see the alliance and the relationship.
Extremely responsive to the emotions.
As I don't know what that was. I can see the alliance is hugely important for setting the stage for skill development. I think skill development can still be hugely important. So there are a lot of therapies we do help develop, our patient skills, whether it's being more assertive, where it's taking more risk, or whatever the development is. I see the alliance being hugely important in that. So it's kind of, I can see it operating in both ways. I know there's always that debate, is it curative in and of itself, or is it really a teeing up for more specific skill development?
Okay.
And I see it both ways. And the second part, what was it? Say it again, Jeffrey.
So should the research be now moving away from horse racing between all these different approaches and looking at what diagnostic change processes and therapists, what it is, studying good therapists and why they get good results?
I think also, well, let me say, I'm not big on the horse race, and as you know, Jeffrey, I'm definitely more inclined to looking at transdiagnostic change principles. I think we've created a lot of arbitrary boundaries, some of it political, some of it economic. I don't think the data supports it. I think just like with personality, things are more dimensional. I think we should be looking more dimensionally at things. And then I think in terms of the therapist, you know, I have a terrible voice. I always could never hold a tune. Always felt bad about that. Would love to be able to. I do sing to myself when I'm alone, music on, but I have to be alone. But I remember as a kid, because I guess the school I went to, you all had to try out for the school concert.
Choral club, yeah.
And I remember trying out, and that year the music teacher says, well, look, it's like, it's not that you have a bad voice, it's you have a limited range. I was like, oh. Now I don't know if that's like a wonderful reframe or not, but I actually think of therapists in the same way. I think they're I mean, I think we have a lot of therapists who can be effective. They may have people may range in terms of, what notes they can hit, and some people can work with psychotics better than others. Some people can tolerate borderline,
Yeah.
I think though, and I think that for me, that's the best explanation of why we can accommodate so many therapists in New York. But I think I tend to be really supportive and generous with therapists, and it's more about, when I work with therapists, I try to help them expand their ranges.
I like that. I love that concept. That's a take home for me. That's great. Yes.
So I'm going to balk on
the moment. I love it.
I'll balk at the idea that they're bad therapists, or
but you're going to have to sing.
Yeah. No. You do not want to hear that.
Well, I have to say I relate to this about me not being able to sing. When I was in 5th grade, they put me in it was called music clinic for people who couldn't carry tunes.
Music clinic.
So now I feel like, okay, I just had a limited range.
I know. Yeah, she was great, but I think, yeah. They were trying to.
Yeah, I loved this. I used to love to sing and play my guitar, and my family would always come and close the doors. I think now I'll just say, I just have a limited range.
Yeah.
I like that.
Yeah, and I think so. To me, like, it's in the end about matching. Like, it's all about matching. Like, you can.
Yeah, that's
certain patients you're going to work. I mean, I won't get into what I think I'm good at, but there's certain types that I have really good tolerance for, and I also appreciate, I remember, Jeffrey, you might remember Michael Lakin, who was one of the therapists.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Michael told me when I remember him telling me when I can't remember the context, but he was saying, like, whenever you take on a patient like a borderline patient, he said, you also have to be mindful of your whole practice. Your whole practice is like a family, and so you have to be mindful of your whole practice and what you can tolerate, like, so is it going to be maybe 30% of my practice or 40%, what can you do? Because you still have this obligation to all your other patients.
Yeah.
And I that was actually, he told that to me. And then I also learned the hard way. I really felt that was true. I think that was
knowing your own emotional capacity.
Yeah. So that still goes back to this idea of knowing yourself, and this idea of matching. Like, you can, and not just matching, but you also have the rest of your practice that you have to take responsibility for.
So I noticed that we have about 6. Oh, go ahead, Kristen. You have something?
Oh, no, I think this is gorgeous because, it's also about making sure that you're staying healthy and that you're taking care of the well-being of the people who you're responsible for. And it's like creating this little cocoon of safety. It's beautiful.
Yeah. Everyone, that's why I've had a lot of wisdoms, and sometimes you're a little late in terms of incorporating them.
So we have a lot of therapists watching and listening tonight, and a lot more in the future. So many of us feel like we're out there in a very difficult time in our world with COVID and stress, allostatic loading on every system falling apart. It seems. What can you say to us to inspire us, Chris, as one of the leaders in our what inspired me to go back?
Well, again, you
inspired
know,
me to get up and go back in my office tomorrow.
I mean, I think you know, there is this thing about Zoom fatigue, right? I mean, I think there's some research about it. So I'll talk about doing teletherapy, because the first thing that comes to mind. And I know it's different. And I know it's taxing, staring at yourself, staring at a screen, you know, and there's different ways in which it's exhausting. You don't get to see the hand wringing or the foot tapping, or, you know, you don't have these other cues, but especially given that Kristen brought up Edtronic, you have other things. You actually can see faces more closely, and you can see
More intimately, right? Than you would you wouldn't get that close in your office.
There are other things that you know. So if you know, it's like if you were blind, your other senses would have to become more sensitive. So I think as clinicians, you know, we're losing something, but we gain something too. So try to embrace the gain. Try to like pay attention. You know, like develop. Now you're learning again. You know, we learned a certain way to look at another person. I remember a patient once said to me, how did she say that? She was very aware of how I watched. You know, she was like, God, she could see how I was like, and it was not something I was like, because it's so automatic. She says, but I can see how you're watching everything, you know, and now it's like, now I only have this little box. So I have to watch differently. But I don't know how tired people are or beaten down by it, but maybe try to reframe it and say, okay, so now I have to like, I have to develop my sensitivities in a different way. That's the first thing that comes to mind, but that's a little inspiring.
Thank you.
That is
That's a good way to
inspiring.
look at it. Yeah.
It is.
I mean, I've been thinking a little bit about that, like, you know, how has this pandemic changed us? Like, it's not about like surviving or making it through. It's like,
Right.
what I'm different, and how am I different in a positive way?
Right.
Yeah.
And we didn't have, you know, when we went through training, we didn't have teletherapy or, you know.
We hardly had video therapy when I started.
That's true.
That was just breaking out and being cost effective.
Yeah, that's true. So we never really had formal training. So we're kind of training ourselves on the fly. But if you think of it that way, then okay, there's a lot to learn.
Yeah.
A lot to learn.
Unfortunately, we have about 2 minutes left, and we're coming toward the end of our time. What we're going to do is we're going to stop recording at 8 o'clock, and then we'll hang around and talk for people who are watching and want to just hear us do some processing. If you can stay on, Chris, for a little while, we'll do that.
Sure, absolutely.
But I do want to thank everybody who needs to sign off at 8 Eastern Standard Time, and hope you come back again. And Chris, I truly, this has been just such a wonderful time for us to share with you. And it's so generous of you to take your time out of your busy schedule and talk to us so openly and honestly. And it just increased my admiration for you, which is always high.
Jeffrey, I was going to say it just increased my envy.
Well, you're a little more honest than me, so.
Damn it.
Yeah.
But I thank you for inviting me. And Jeffrey, you were right. It was fun. And yeah, and I really enjoyed the questions, Barbara and Kristen. And
Oh, thank you.
But we'd love to have you come back next year and do another one, because there's so much. There's so much to talk about, and you could probably see that we all have a passion for this work, and we hope we communicate it to the people that are watching and who are also out there trying to do hard work in difficult times. So thank you all for joining us tonight, and we will hang around for a little while and answer questions and chat a bit. So thank you all.
Chris, you did a great job.